Okay, so today I am going to talk to you about texting. So texting is becoming a popular and potentially preferred mode of communication for many. In fact, we may expand our social networks by keeping in touch with friends on the other side of the world. But texting may also allow us to have private conversations with friends sitting in close proximity to us. So not only are we able to maintain private conversations with our friends, we're also able to maintain a much wider social network. And let's face it, being social is really important for humans. So there's a lot of important utility in being able to communicate through text message. For example, texting is fast and it's short. Cognition is hard and humans are lazy. So if we can find a way to reduce the amount of cognitive effort we need to communicate, we're going to do everything that we can to do that. Because texting is convenient, but even though we have this convenience in texting, it unfortunately lacks the richness that we might experience in face-to-face communication. When we lack this richness, it could potentially increase the likelihood of miscommunicating our intentions or misunderstanding what our texting partners are trying to say to us. Well, the good news is that research suggests that just like face-to-face communication, we have the ability to flexibly adapt to understand our communication partners. So today I'm going to talk to you about a few things that might help us do just that, flexibly adapt to context that lacks a lot of rich cues we use in face-to-face communication. So for example, in face-to-face communication, we have the ability to read a person's body language and tone of voice. And these sociopragmatic cues are extremely important for interpreting the extra information that's not provided in the literal language spoken by our conversation partners. Luckily, in text-based communication, we have learned to flexibly adapt to context in which we are not always afforded these extra cues like tone of voice or body language to aid in interpretation. So how might we do this? Well, we have the potential to imply tone of voice through typographical cues. For example, tone of voice can be implied through what is called extralinguistic or paralinguistic cues. Through tone of voice and body language, for example. But in texting context, we can do this through the use of typographical cues such as punctuation, emoticons, capitalization, and italics. We've all had that situation where we got an email from our boss or maybe even our grandma where they send an email in all caps and it feels like somebody is screaming at you. So we're actually very sensitive to these cues. So what effect does the use of typographical cues have on communication style, interpretation, adaptation in these novel texting contexts? Well, let's first consider what happens in face-to-face communication. So face-to-face communication is going to benefit from the use of multimodal cues such as nonverbal cues like eye gaze, vocal prosody, and shared attention. But texting is unimodal, and we are really just constrained by the visual modality by processing specifically the linguistic information, but also typographical and grammatical cues, making it a much less rich environment for nonverbal cues, at least in comparison to face-to-face communication. Luckily, we are able to make use of this unimodal context by changing, say, vocal spelling of words, using non-standard spelling of words. Emoticons are really important, and we can even manipulate grammatical markers. All of these typographic cues have the potential to indicate tone of voice. More recently, researchers found that the use of one-word responses followed by a single period in texting context, for example, was perceived to be relatively rude, a little bit terse and insincere, at least in comparison to a handwritten note. But really, the problem is not only that texting is lacking in nonverbal cues, but it's that the messages are short and ambiguous. And when having a face-to-face conversation, we are able to rely really heavily on conventional multimodal nonverbal cues. So multimodal cues are often absent in text-based communication. But guess what? As texters, we're really crafty. So we can actually interpret a sender's intentions beyond the literal meaning by taking advantage of typographical cues that we send in text-based communication. How is it that we do this? Well, the first thing that we do is we reach into the recesses of our personal history with our texters, or even the person that we are currently having a texting conversation with. And our personal history will essentially shade the color of the message. And if we get the coloring wrong, unfortunately, we have the potential to misunderstand what our texting partner is trying to tell us. For some, this might make us a little bit uncomfortable, a little bit uncertain. But when we aren't quite sure what someone is trying to say, we might try to handle this uncertainty by making a prediction about what the texting partner's intentions are. This is also termed the uncertainty reduction theory. So what we might do in a texting context when we're not quite sure what are the intentions of our texting partner, so we might hang out a bit, send a few text messages back and forth, see what types of cues they're going to throw at us. Because remember, texting is unimodal. We may be only able to decode ambiguous information in a text by relying on the history with the person and the typographical cues they send to us. So for example, imagine this text message exchange with one significant other. So in this example, we see that someone sends their significant other a question of, do you want to have dinner tonight? And the significant other responds, no, period. So like I said before, sending a one-word response with a period has been shown to be a little bit terse, a little bit rude. We might want to avoid doing that. So sending a one-word response in a period kind of indicates some intentionality of kind of maybe annoyance or directness or just being a little bit terse. So if you want to engage in reciprocal behavior with your conversation partner, you might respond with fine, period, because that again is going to put out some intentionality into the world. So in this context, if this happened to me, I would have probably found it to be very surprising to see my significant other use a one-word response followed by a period. Why? Well, because he never does it. And it was interpreted by me as being a bit terse. So what did I do? Well, I'm a reciprocal communicator, so I will meet my partner halfway. So I reciprocate and ding him back by using the same terse typographical cue. So what I did here when interpreting this text message was to basically synthesize the known personality traits about my significant other and integrate that with the typographic cues he used to communicate with me so I could derive his intentionality. So I might also do the same thing in face-to-face communication with him. So for example, if he uses vocal prosody to convey annoyance, I might respond in a reciprocal way. So it seems that even in text messaging, we reciprocally engage our conversation partners. And in fact, recent research in my lab has shown that unknowing texters also seem kind of annoyed when a conversation partner uses negative intonational punctuation or punctuation that is intended to convey tone of voice, which in turn impacts their mood and how they reciprocally engage. So we see this in face-to-face communication, and it's typically termed emotional contagion. So emotional contagion refers to the mimicry of affective responses specifically, but we also see that we will mimic each other's behavior or synchronize, behaviorally entrain, or align our behaviors in lots of different ways when we're communicating, not just through text or through emotion. So emotion contagion really refers to the mimicry of affective responses from conversation partners or just being around other emotionally charged, for example, people. I actually do this a lot when I watch a sad movie or see a friend crying. It makes me cry. So we see that even in a texting context, we have the ability to prime our conversation partners through the use of punctuation that conveys emotional intention. So what's really cool about this is that even though texting is coming in the form of really reduced down communication, we are still finding adaptive ways to flexibly communicate with our conversation partners by creating novel ways to convey extra linguistic information to our communication partners. This is really important to maintain social relationships, and we're coming up with really creative ways to do it. More and more research is being done, and it still needs to continue. Nevertheless, research has indicated that we do seem to adapt our texting behavior to the context that we find ourselves in similar ways to face-to-face communication. So keep in mind that when you send a one-word response followed by a period, or you're using some other type of extra linguistic information in your texting, that your communication partners know what you're doing. So if you don't really want to ruffle the feathers of your conversation partner, take care in the extra linguistic typographical cues you choose to send to your conversation partner, because they matter, and they could just be as harsh as a terse tone of voice.